Hi, and welcome back to the Smarter Literacy Podcast from Ascend Smarter Intervention, where we simplify effective literacy instruction so every student gets what they need and every educator gets to read a little easier. I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Corey, and today we're going to dig even deeper into the writing topic because this is so important. And honestly, it's one of the things that our students struggle with so much. Now, when students struggle with longer form writing, so we're talking about paragraphs, essays, it usually shows up in one of two ways. So either we get stream of consciousness writing, or we get rubric trapped writing. Now, writing should not be either this totally free-flowing, chaotic thing or this rigid box checking. Students really need a repeatable planning process that they actually own themselves.
Right, and isn't that true for all of us? Even when I think back to when I was writing my master's thesis and basically how my planning process, which I had at that point really began to perfect over my years of being in school, was even just the reason I was able to start and finish the darn thing.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good point when you think about your own writing. You're like, okay, am I a stream of consciousness? Like, oh, let's just let it all come out. Am I, oh no, it has to have this, or this? Or do we start to think a little bit more in terms of a process of, okay, what am I going to do first? What am I going to do next? What am I going to do last? And I think that's just something so important for us to think about. So I see this all the time with students, but I have a couple that I'm thinking of right now because I have a few students that I'm working with that struggle quite a bit in their writing for different reasons. So last week, I was working with one of my students who was so trapped by his rubric. So he was supposed to write a 5-paragraph essay about football. So we're thinking American football here. He got to choose the topic, and he loves football. I mean, honestly, he could tell you every player. He could just talk about football forever. He knows so much about it. And he was also given a really detailed rubric about what he needed to include. It was this very structured outline. And it told him exactly, this is what the first sentence needs to be, this is the second sentence, this is the third sentence. And he was supposed to be including research into that as well. So we wanted to make sure that he was citing things, and he wanted to make sure he was doing this right, like perfect. And he's a hardworking student, and he wanted to do the right thing. But because of that, he got so caught up in, I'm going to put researching in air quotes here, and finding appropriate articles that it just completely replaced his own thinking altogether. And so by the time he was putting this together, the whole thing sounded like an AI paper. It sounded just like artificial intelligence, even though it's a topic that he cares so much about. He could have told you about it for days. He honestly just wasn't leading with his own thinking, and he really didn't have an opportunity to really think about, what is it that I want to write about and what is it that I want to share about? And so his writing, I mean, honestly, kind of sucked a little bit. I was like, this is not good.
Right.
This does not sound like you at all.
Right, because again, writing is supposed to be the form that we can express ourselves, express our thoughts and ideas, and we wanted to sound like us as much as possible. And I remember being this kid. I was the perfectionist, the rule follower, and when I was given a graphic organizer to fill out, I did it exactly as my teacher showed us, exactly what my teacher wanted. So there was very little creativity in my writing when I first, thinking back to kind of earlier school days, when we were really starting to get into longer form writing. And it was really hard to unlearn this routine of I must follow the graphic organizer to the T.
Exactly. It was interesting because, I was working with him and he really just wanted to get this paper done for his class. But he's like, okay, I need to get, now let's do the last sentence. It's a thesis. What's a thesis? And it was clear that he just honestly hadn't internalized any of the writing process himself. He was just checking the boxes. And I know we've talked about this on a few of our last podcasts. But when we get so stuck just checking the boxes, we kind of lose the bigger picture.
Yes.
And so, that writing just doesn't actually like you said, share something that we would like to share. It's a way that we express our thinking. And it's one thing when you're writing an academic paper, and I understand there are certain standards and things that we're trying to hit. And I also understand that there's a very specific structure that some of the common assessments that we're using to assess writing are looking for. And we need to find really that balance between the kind of scientific structure of it and the art. And we talked about that a lot recently too. It's just kind of this balance of the science or the structure and the art and the creativity. And so I think for this particular student, that was where his writing totally went wrong. But I also have another student that I've been working with, and she is more of a stream of consciousness writer. So she's less tied to the rubric, less kind of rigid in that way. There's no structure there at all, right? So she's so creative. She has endless ideas, which are beautiful. And especially thinking about narrative writing, but she'll even do this in informative, right? It really doesn't matter. There's just no natural beginning, middle, end. It's kind of like, where are we going with this? It is just like, this just all came out of my head and like, it just keeps going and there's no stop to it. She just keep going forever. And it becomes really overwhelming when she has to start kind of editing or pulling it together. One, the process takes forever. So it's taking her 2 to 3 times as long as it takes anybody else to write this certain piece. And then when she goes to edit it, it's like, oh my gosh, we're going to have to be editing for a really long time because you just had all of these ideas. So there's really no kind of clear container or no structure. So it's almost going the other way, right? So it's like, okay, now we only have creativity, but no structure.
Right. And as someone who used to be a 7th grade English teacher, I saw this a lot. I still see it. I have a student very much like the one you just mentioned, even currently, where when we started, it was nothing but stream of consciousness writing, especially in narrative, but like you said, in her other formats as well. And it would be to the point where we would take a whole session basically to go through her editing because we really would need to take it step by step and for her to even realize why it wasn't the best writing, right? to put it nicely. And so this is where it does feel hard. How do we find that balance between allowing kids to be creative and use their voice versus you got to have some kind of structure here because otherwise I kind of feel like I have whiplash. I have no idea where we're going.
Yeah, you're just like on this boat with them and you're like, I have no idea.
Are
like
we going in circles?
Yeah.
Like, what's happening?
I don't know what's happening. Love it. And it's interesting because it on the surface looks like these are two totally opposite issues, but at the end of the day, it's actually the same root cause. Mm-hmm. It's that neither of these students or any of the students that we're working with really has a planning process that they're sticking to that is allowing them to really find the balance between that structure and that creativity. And, one of the things that I notice with my students, especially when we get started, is that they often just start writing immediately. So whether that's I have this rubric, okay, I've got sentence 1, I'm just going to write sentence 2, I'm going to write based on the rubric. Or for my stream of consciousness students, like, oh, I just have this idea in my head and I'm just going to start writing. That's sometimes where the issue originates from. And I think this is so normal because even my own kids, but I'm thinking specifically of my 9th grader who has had a very clear writing process that they have learned from, honestly, I feel like they started in elementary and they've really taken it through and they call it a CERC. And basically it's that you're making a claim and then you're having your evidence and your reasoning for your evidence, right? Like you're putting everything together, you're concluding with fact, you're putting it all together. But he was like, I hate CERCs because I don't feel like I know how to write a narrative piece anymore.
Yeah.
I don't think I know how to do any of that. He's like, all I know how to do is follow this formula and I don't know how to do anything else. And that's sad. That's why I think a lot of kids are turning to AI is because it feels like if it has to be super formulaic anyway, then why not just let the formula generator do it for me?
Exactly. I could totally feel that because I remember getting to a writing unit. I think this was in either 9th or 10th grade for myself as well. And it was a narrative writing unit. And at that point, it had been drilled into me so much that you follow this specific formula. So when we got to narrative writing, I'm like, I don't know how to write narrative. What do you mean I have to be creative? I don't know how to start a creative piece. What are you talking about? And that was as a student. As a teacher, though, I also understand how it feels easier to give students that very structured formula because it is so hard to try to find that balance and teach that balance. And so sometimes it is easier just like, oh yeah, follow the formula, this is your paragraph has to have a topic sentence, this. You have to have your 3 details and so on and so forth. On both ends, I see how I struggled because I had this very kind of strict structure. But then as a teacher, I'm like, but what else do I do? Because I don't know how to teach them to have both, especially when I first started teaching. So yeah, I don't want my kids, though, to feel like what your son is feeling. That to me is like, no, writing should be as enjoyable as reading can be. It's where you can express you. And I want my kids to be able to express themselves, whether they are writing informative, narrative, persuasive, or opinion.
Absolutely. And that's what I was thinking about too with my student last week who was trying to work on football, right? It was like, just share with me what you know, share with me your love. And so I think when we come down to it, if we really want to think about what can that balance look like, we can still provide structure. So what I instructed him to do is, we're going to take a step back. We're going to put the rubric away for a minute. We can use the rubric later when we make sure that we have everything that we need, right? That can even be a little bit more of our editing process to make sure that we've done this. But let's take a step back and let's start with step 1. And step 1 is about brainstorming. And when we are brainstorming, this is where we are thinking freely. This is where we are capturing what you already know. And so in this particular case, he knew so much about football. And so just talk to me about football. Just talk to me about some of these things, right? Let's just capture some of the things that you already know. And then from here, let's start to list some ideas, some questions, some curiosities. So especially if you're being asked to write about something maybe that you have less knowledge on, because a lot of times in school, that's especially as we get older, that's what we're being asked to do. We're being asked to write a response or write something to something that maybe we've just learned about. And so we can start to list some of our questions or curiosities about this. It's not organized. It doesn't even need to be bulleted, nothing like that. This is where the creativity lives. This is where it's just like, okay, this is where your stream of consciousness can be okay.
Yes.
But we're not trying to formulate sentences and make them beautiful. It's just, let me dump thoughts.
Yes.
Let me dump ideas.
I actually love this stage with my students. It really is. It's that creative section, like you said. And it's almost like, okay, throw everything and anything you can at the wall. We'll worry about what sticks later, but if you've got a thought, if you've got a question, put it down. Don't worry, like you said, about the sentences. We're not even writing sentences. And don't even worry about spelling. This is just a dumping ground for those ideas. And let's put as much as we can in here so we have more to choose from when we actually start getting into that writing process. And that's very freeing for them to be like, oh, okay. And I'm like, yeah, and you might come back and be like, you know what? I don't like that idea actually, or that doesn't really fit with what I'm talking about. Perfect. That's wonderful.
I love that. I love perfect. That's wonderful. I love that. Absolutely. And I think too, this is a place where you can even just we like to use a graphic organizer here that's almost more like a cloud or a bubble or just here's a container. We still want it to have a container, but let's just get all of this down. And for our older students, that might look like, yeah, you're already working on the computer. So this might be a place where you dictate and you just dictate your thoughts, you dictate your ideas and don't put them into sentences necessarily. These really should be, I know I said it doesn't have to be like beautiful bullet points, but it should be just parts of a sentence or just little things that you're thinking about. And so, for example, thinking back to my student who was writing about football, all of a sudden he was coming up with Travis Kelce and Tom Brady and all. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'm hearing you talk about players. Okay, great. Awesome. So you're sharing a bunch of players. Let's get their names down. Great. Okay, then you're talking about, different plays and play structure. Great. That's awesome. Let's kind of just jot a few of those down. Then he was getting into kind of safety and gear and equipment and, they wear helmets and they this and they that. So again, it was just like, great. Get all of those things just down in little bullet points or just dictate, just let that all come through. It's so beautiful.
Yes.
So fun. Then once we do that, right? That really beautiful place where that's the art. That's where a lot of your creativity comes. Then we can get into the structure. So we lead with the creativity and the brainstorm, and then we move into step 2. And step 2 is where we start to draft and organize intentionally. So this is where we start to group those related ideas. So for example, like I was talking about, I started to be like, oh, I listed a bunch of players. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, I listed a bunch of different play types. That's interesting. Oh, I listed a bunch of different gear. That's interesting. And so this is a place where I'm a huge fan for color coding everything.
Right.
But this is a place where I might have them start to say, all right, I want you to start kind of putting these in categories or groups.
Yeah.
Which I know, coming back to our vocabulary, when we ask students to categorize or think about main idea, that's what you're doing here. You're asking them to categorize their own thinking.
Yes.
Which is why it's so important that we do that in the reading instruction. But that way they can start to say, oh, okay, let me group these ideas. Now I can start to create that logical flow where now when he was thinking, I have to have a research article, so I'm just going to go to the research article and basically read it and kind of copy it and turn that into my sentence. It was like, okay, great. Now that we have some of these ideas, we can start to look for some research articles that kind of support or go with these different ideas. So let's start to now look at some research that aligns with gear and being protective against concussions. Let's think about some of these plays. And one of the things that we learned from the research was any football team basically can have, an upward of 100 high impact hits during a game. And so anyway, we were able to take what he already knew and his thoughts and ideas and tie research back into that by this kind of organization where we're starting to think about that organization and that logical flow. And then we just add the introduction and conclusion.
Yeah.
But that way you already have this really beautiful structure that's not, it can become a little bit more rigid in the sense of like, great, as you're organizing, we want to make sure we're organizing in this way.
Right.
But we don't start there.
Right. And personally, both as a writer and a teacher, this is my favorite part. I love the creativity of the brainstorming, kind of throwing those ideas out there. But because I'm a person who likes creativity in a structured way, I love being able to sit down with my own writing or with my student who is now looking at their brainstorming, like what's next? And like you were doing with your students, okay, I'm noticing you're saying a lot about star players or gear or protection within the context of football. And it's like, okay, what ideas can we form around all those ideas that you've thrown at the wall? What one are we liking the best, right? Where do we feel like we can really dive in? And again, that's good, gets those gears turning in their head. And they're starting to be like, oh, maybe I am a writer. Maybe I do have something to say versus, again, just trying to copy from somewhere else.
Right, absolutely. And you make such a great point. It is fun. It's fun to see, oh, this is what connects. This is where they start to put their own pieces together. And this is also to what you said earlier, where you start to realize, oh, I had some of these other ideas in my brainstorm, but we're ditching those because those don't really fit into these groups or categories.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go ahead and cross those out. And I don't need to talk about all of those. And that's where you can start to get rid of some of that stream of consciousness writing where your students had some details that didn't matter at all. They didn't need to be included.
Right.
This is where they would find that when they move into that structure of, okay, great, let's really think about what it is that we don't need as much as we are thinking about what are the categories or groups. And really, when we think about structured writing, a lot of times if we're trying to create a paragraph or a 5-paragraph essay, we're really looking for 3 structured groups.
Yeah.
When they're thinking about their ideas, we really need to come up with kind of 3 main ideas. Or if we're thinking about a narrative, we're trying to follow a narrative story arc where it's, okay, we need to have an introduction to characters and setting, we need to get into the problem, and then we need to transition to the solution.
Yeah.
And everything kind of needs to fit into those 3 parts.
Absolutely. And especially, we had mentioned this in the last episode, but we talked about these writing routines really help our students where they're not those passive writers. But I can kind of see someone saying out there, how could we maybe, since our kids are going to be using AI, it's like going to be a losing battle, how can we maybe turn AI into a potential tool for our students? I think this would be a great step where, okay, they've thrown all those things at the wall and maybe you're not there to help them kind of make those connections and they're really just not able to do it themselves. Okay, now this is where they can use AI. Like, here's all the ideas I have, and here's all the information I have. Can you help me group this into different categories so I can more easily see what I can write about in this? And AI is a great tool where it will quickly be able to do that and say, like, hey, I'm noticing this, this, and this. And that might just be able to give your student a light bulb moment. So that's where one area I can see in writing where AI can be that tool that does get the students to that next step without you necessarily needing to be there for them.
Absolutely. That's such a great point. And I do think that is a really beautiful place to use that because AI is a good tool for pattern recognition as well. And so they'll be able to say, okay, here's all my brainstorm, here's my thoughts, here's my ideas. Yeah, can you help me group this into a few different content buckets or ideas that then I can take and really pull it into my actual draft and my actual writing. So I love that. I think that's so beautiful. And then finally, we want to move into the final step. So, step 3, which is where we do start editing. And when we edit, we really want to go back to what we were talking about in the last podcast episode. So, in the last podcast episode, we were talking about spelling and sentence writing. And so, when I start to think about editing, I want students to go back to their sentence writing routine. So, we really start to think about, all right, do we have all the pieces? So again, we use the acronym CAMPS. So we want to be checking for, do we have capital appearance? Does it look good? And that's whether we're handwriting or we're writing on the computer. We want to make sure we don't have extra spaces or that kind of stuff. Meaning, so do we have a who or what, did what, when, where, why, or how? Then we can get into punctuation. Do I have appropriate punctuation? And spelling. And one of the things that I actually really like to do as part of this step 3 is I actually make them take their draft and break it into individual sentences. So instead of looking at it as a full paragraph or a full essay, I actually say, okay, we're going to look at this one at a time because the brain has a hard time processing all of the information when it's all jumbled together.
Yep.
And so instead, we're going to look at this sentence by sentence. And so as we go to edit, I actually don't want this to look like a paragraph or an essay. I want it broken and I paragraph break it. I mean, honestly, we're paragraph breaking it, or if we're handwriting these, they need to be handwritten sentence by sentence instead of a big old chunk. We need to have each sentence on its own line. And the reason that I want them to do that is because I want them to actually find, can that who or what did what by highlighting or underlining in, who or what in red, did what in blue. I want them finding their punctuation and I want them highlighting that in orange. Have an entire process for editing, which we can get into more in our next episode. But I want to make sure that they have the ability to see each sentence one at a time to make sure that that actually works because that editing process is very structured.
Yes.
Very much the scientific piece. It's less of the creative piece, but if we can almost make it look a little pretty by looking at it, then it feels a little bit more creative and we can see, oh, do we actually have all the parts? Do we have what we need before we stick it all back together?
That visual piece being so important. And I even tell my students, especially as they're learning how to edit and edit well, this is sometimes the longest part of the writing process, and that's okay because this is your final chance to really make sure that what you're saying sounds good and also sounds like you. So again, I do the same thing. We go through sentence by sentence, and we don't go through it just once. We go through it multiple times. We'll go through our little checklist there, and I'm like, okay, you know what? Just this time around, let's just look for capital. So our brain is focusing on one thing right now. If we miss a few and we catch it later, great. But let's just go through it and let's just practice this right now. Okay, great. Then, okay, appearance, like you said, if they're typing it out, do you have any weird spaces? Does anything look like you need to tighten it up a little bit? And just by doing it kind of step by step and teaching our kids that editing requires multiple look throughs, it's not just a one and done kind of thing. And this is a life skill. Any kind of writing you're going to do in real life, you're going to be editing it multiple times before you have a final product. At least you should be.
Absolutely.
And so it's going to take your kids a while in the beginning. And that's okay because the stronger and better they get at it, it won't take as long. My student that I mentioned earlier, who we were like basically taking a whole session to do this, now it's not even a quarter of a session. And she is so quickly able to, oh, there's my issues. And again, those she's got the color coding down perfectly. And I don't even have to tell her now what she needs to do. She just does it. And her writing has gotten so much stronger because of it.
And that's exactly what we're going for. And I think you made a lot of great points there. We often, from an executive functioning perspective, will have students basically try and take their best guess for how long each of the pieces is going to take.
Mhm.
And it's so funny because in the beginning, they're like, oh, like brainstorming and thinking about what I'm going to write is going to take the longest. And then maybe actually writing will take a little bit less time than that. And then editing will take the least amount of time. And what they actually start to realize is it's the opposite for most students.
Yes.
You're going to actually spend the least amount of time brainstorming because you already have ideas and thoughts and things like that. And then drafting and kind of pulling it together takes a little bit longer. And then editing honestly takes the longest time. But also, we do the same thing where if we break that down into each of those individual sentences, we focus on one step at a time. And that's such a great executive functioning strategy as well, because it allows the brain to really focus on just one thing. Because even if we think about individual sentences, if I'm saying, okay, we're using the acronym CAMPS, that requires a lot of cognitive flexibility of flipping back and forth between, okay, I'm looking for a capital, then I'm looking for, does it look good? Then does it sound good? Then do I have a punctuation? And then do I have a spelling? And we also notice that a lot of times students, when they're writing, will try to edit while they're writing.
Yes.
And so it's very much, no, don't do that. Stay in the step that we're in. Give your brain an opportunity to focus and just do what we are doing right now. And so I do the same thing. Let's find all the capitals. And this is also great because if you're in whole class or you're working in small groups, you can have students start to do this with their own writing, but you can also have them switch papers with their peers and say, okay, you're going to go ahead and trade with your shoulder partner, or you're going to go ahead and trade. And, I want your partner now to see if they can't find all of the capitals, right? And just underline all of the capitals, whether it's there or not. It's not like I'm checking this to see everything that you did wrong.
Right.
It's just I'm going and basically highlighting or underlining everywhere that there should have been a capital.
Yeah.
Or, okay, I'm going through and identifying who or what did what. And sometimes, like you said, you might go back to writing for multiple different purposes, and that's totally fine. Or even partners could potentially make the edit right there for the partner. And by the time you're done going through this whole process, everybody's kind of worked through that together. And like you said, they get used to the routine. Then it becomes automatic and they can do it on their own, because that's the biggest issue that I've realized I have in my teaching, at least when I started. It's like I was taking so much of the process into my own hands of saying, okay, now this.
Right.
Okay, now that. Okay, I want you to do this or do this worksheet, do that. That's you directing what needs to happen. But what we actually need is students directing what needs to happen.
Exactly. And I even tell my students sometimes it is good to edit, to have someone else edit your paper, and not necessarily like a teacher, but like someone else who has fresh eyes, hasn't seen this before. Because sometimes even when we're reading our own pieces, or as a teacher, I've already read through this piece several times, our brains are starting to fill in the gaps because we knew what's supposed to be there. We know what the intention is. So our brain actually fills it in. So it seems like, oh, that's actually there. Get a fresh set of eyes. And it's like they can just catch it just because their brains aren't filling in the gap. And when I tell them this, I'm like, real authors, writers, everyone, that's why they have editors who go through and check, because their brains aren't catching this because they've worked through this so many times. And you can catch a lot of things, but can you catch 100% of the time? More than likely, no.
No, and it's like you said, it's our brain is filling in the holes and the gaps, and it does that for good reason. That's part of why we can be so effective at what we do, is because our brain kind of creates that little circuitry there. And so it's good, but by creating that opportunity for somebody else to take a look at it, or just coming back to it for multiple days, right? Where it may be, hey, today we're just editing for this one very specific thing. And then next time that we bring this back out, we're going to edit for this next piece. And so that being said, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about editing specifically on our next podcast, because it actually follows our exact same reading fluency process. So we'll show how those two connect. But that's your third step.
Yeah.
And so we want students to be able to essentially reconnect with their own thinking. And especially when we think about AI and what AI is doing right now,
Yep.
we need to reconnect to our thinking process.
Mhm.
And so by using these 3 steps where we don't want AI brainstorming for us, that's
Right.
you get to brainstorm. That's the start of it all. And then from there, if we need a little help organizing our brainstorm, fine.
Mhm.
Maybe that's the place. But then we don't need AI drafting for
Right.
us. You can then draft from that organized outline. And that way it sounds like you, it looks
Yeah.
like you, right? And then you can edit that yourself. We don't need AI providing the art in
Yeah.
our work. We don't want that. And so I think, that's going to be really important that students learn how to do that and how to organize their information and how to really separate that kind of creative process, that brainstorming process,
Yeah.
from the more structured process and to be able to do it independently. Like you said, you want students to get so used to that routine
Mhm.
that always feels the same
Yes.
that then they can internalize it and be like, okay, I got this. And so instead of it being all over the place or being super rigid and like, oh, nope, I literally just followed an outline and had, I don't know, 0 creative voice in there. It feels, again, like something they own, something they made, they created.
Yeah. And of course, we recognize that teaching writing, it takes a lot of patience because to be a truly independent writer, it's just gonna take time and practice. They're not gonna get it the first time. They're not even gonna get it the first year. I mean, they should definitely be better than the beginning of the year. As they continue with that process and that balance between here's my structure, but here's how I can be creative in that structure, they're going to become stronger, better writers, better thinkers too, to the point when we're asking them later in life, in like high school and college and beyond, to write responses, but they have to be really critical thinkers because they have to think about how do I want to respond? What do I believe? Do I agree with the research? We're asking them to give you even higher level. They're able to do that. And there's still going to be that process of brainstorming, writing, editing. We're saying it's not going to happen in like, 2 seconds ever, but they're going to be quicker, independent, and they're going to be confident in their answers, which to me is the most important part. When you can look back on your writing and be proud of what you wrote and even seeing how much you've grown as a writer, I think that is one of the most beautiful parts of the writing process.
Absolutely. And so, just to reiterate, if we want to be able to create independent writers that are not relying on us to show them exactly what this needs to look like or exactly how to do this, we can't just hand them a super scripted rubric that says, okay, this is exactly what that needs to look like. And we also can't just let them go and hope that it flows. We
Right.
have to teach them the process. We have to have these 3 steps: brainstorm, draft, edit. And we also need to be clear about what that looks like at
Mhm.
each of those individual stages. And so if you want to see what this looks like in a little bit more depth in our instruction, we do have a Spotlight PD for long form writing routines. And it's called Long Form Writing Routines, Building Independent Writers. So definitely check that out. We'll walk through our whole process for brainstorming and drafting and that editing process that we'll get into in a little bit more depth in our next podcast episode. But that way you can just see exactly what it looks like and take away some ideas for your own teaching. And if you haven't already, you can grab our free guide, Smarter Literacy Routines, where we outline this writing process alongside all of our other routines that we use to support students in developing independence in their literacy skills, so both reading and writing.
And in our next episode, we will be sharing more about our long form editing process. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smarter Literacy Podcast. Make sure to subscribe for more strategies and insights to make delivering effective literacy instruction easy, or at least easier. And if you found this episode helpful, share it with a friend or leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help others find the show, and we are beyond grateful for your support. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy teaching.